Hi everyone, today we're going to look into different types of fat in the IB biology syllabus, and this is under the unit B.1.1, molecules, carbohydrates, and lipids of the syllabus. So let's get right into it. We have mainly three different types of fat in the IB biology syllabus, and this is going to be saturated fat, trans fat, and unsaturated fat. First, let's start off with saturated fat. Now, saturated fat is fat that only has single carbon bonds in its structure. And therefore, because it doesn't have any double carbon bonds, it's obviously going to have a very straight structure. So if we were to draw a skeletal sort of formula of it, it would look like this. So it has a very straight sort of formation. And saturated fat is very bad for our health. Next, let's move on to trans fat. Now, trans fat is kind of like a special type of fat in that it has double carbon bonds, but these double carbon bonds are trans bonds. And what I mean by that is when we're talking about unsaturated fat, we talk about cis unsaturated bonds. But in trans fat, we do have double carbon bonds, but these are going to be trans bonds. So it's essentially unsaturated fat, but with trans bonds. Maybe we'll speak about trans fat later on after we've covered unsaturated fat. So let's straight dive into unsaturated fat first. Now, unsaturated fat is a type of fat that has double carbon bonds. But again, it's not only double carbon bonds only, they also have like single carbon bonds, but they do have a couple of double carbon bonds, and depending on the number of double carbon bonds that unsaturated fats may have, we can classify it into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat. But these double carbon bonds give this sort of bent structure for the unsaturated fat because it introduces a kink. So these double carbon bonds cause a bent structure. And I'll show you what I mean by that by drawing a chemical formula of it. So let's draw a fatty acid, an unsaturated fatty acid, in order to see what it means that a double carbon bond introduces a bend. So we're first going to draw the carboxylic group. Okay, so there you have it. This is an unsaturated fatty acid structure. And as you can see, because we have a double carbon bond right here, this introduces a sort of a bend to the general structure. So because of the double carbon bond, the structure of the fatty acid essentially bends. And another thing to note here is that when I drew this fatty acid, you can see that the hydrogens are on the same side of the fatty acid, right? The orientation of the hydrogens, generally relative to the carbons, is that it's on the same side. Now, this is what we call a cis unsaturated structure, and it's because the hydrogens are on the same side. If they were to be on opposite sides, we would call this a trans bond, and it would go for a trans fat. So this is a cis unsaturated structure, and that is because we have cis bonds right here, wherein we have the H's on the same side, right? But if we were talking about trans fat, the H's would be on different sides. And that is essentially the difference between unsaturated fat and trans fat. Now, how you get from unsaturated fat to trans fat is through a process called hydrogenation. And hydrogenation is essentially just structurally altering the unsaturated fat by adding hydrogen, chemically adding it. So chemically adding atoms of hydrogen essentially breaks these cis bonds, breaks these cis double carbon bonds, and essentially creates the structure of a trans fat where we have trans bonds. Right, and surprisingly, trans fat is essentially really bad for our health, much like saturated fat. But unsaturated fat, it's really good for our health. And depending on the number of double carbon bonds that you may have in the unsaturated fat structure, we can divide this into two. We can divide it into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Now, in monounsaturated structures, we're essentially going to have only one double carbon bond. However, in polyunsaturated, we can have many double carbon bonds. And by the way, all of these are cis unsaturated fat structures.